The people who made the worst calls weren't reckless. They were careful. They were the ones who sat longer with the problem, who ran the numbers twice, who said out loud, "I'm not going to rush this one." And then they got it wrong, not despite the care, but through it. Something in the machinery of caution bent the outcome before they ever reached a decision. That's the thing nobody tells you about risk, the part that stays quiet until it's too late. There's a mechanism that activates the moment the stakes feel high enough to matter. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like fear exactly. It feels like focus. It feels like the kind of sharpened attention that should produce better thinking. Your mind locks onto the worst possible result, not because you asked it to, because it was designed for exactly that. The potential loss becomes so vivid, so immediate, so textured in your imagination that it stops being one possible outcome among many. It becomes the reference point against which everything else gets measured, and once that happens, the comparison is already broken. A loss of $100 psychologically does not feel like the mirror image of a gain of $100. The loss lands harder, roughly twice as hard for most people, sometimes more. This isn't a personality trait. It isn't a failure of discipline or a sign of weakness. It's a structural feature of how the mind assigns weight to outcomes. Losses pull with more force than equivalent gains push, which means the moment you enter a high-stakes situation, you are not working with a neutral scale. You are working with a scale that was already tilted before you picked up the first piece of evidence. Now imagine a man who has spent 15 years building something. A business, a project, a career. It doesn't matter. He arrives at a decision point. The choice isn't between something good and something bad. The choice is between two uncertain paths, each with real probability of loss. He tells himself he's thinking clearly. He takes his time. He goes for a walk and comes back. He talks it through with someone he trusts. He feels, genuinely, that he has been deliberate. What he doesn't feel, what no instrument available to him can detect, is that his sense of the probabilities has been quietly distorted from the inside. The bad outcome has been rehearsed in his mind so many times, with such physical and emotional detail, that it has grown heavier than the numbers support. The possibility of loss is now perceived as more likely than it actually is, not because he's irrational. Because the very act of taking the decision seriously activated a machinery that was never designed to stay neutral. He makes the cautious choice. He avoids the risk. He feels afterward that he handled it well, and maybe he did. Maybe the caution was warranted, but he has no way of knowing, because the mechanism that weighted his decision was invisible to him the entire time. This is where it starts, not with recklessness, with the honest effort to be careful, and the quiet distortion that effort contains. Here is what actually happens when you try to be careful under pressure. The mind does not slow down. It narrows. The attention collapses inward toward the thing that threatens, and the periphery disappears. Information that doesn't fit the threat becomes harder to process. Evidence that contradicts the feared outcome gets evaluated with more skepticism than evidence that confirms it. You are not lying to yourself. You are operating exactly as the structure was built to operate. The problem is that the structure was built for a different kind of danger, immediate, physical, visible, not for the calibrated evaluation of probabilities across time. So the careful person, trying to think through a complex risk, often ends up thinking less clearly, not more. The very weight they feel, the gravity of the situation, is the same weight that pulls the scale. There's a particular irony buried here. When the stakes are low, the mind is relatively free. You can weigh options without much interference. The emotional signal is quiet. You pick. When the stakes are high, the emotional signal is loud, and it floods the deliberation before deliberation has a chance to function. You experience yourself as reasoning. You are, in part. But underneath the reasoning, a faster process has already made its move, and the reasoning you're doing is partly explanation, not exploration. This doesn't mean the outcome will be wrong. Sometimes the fast process lands in the right place. Sometimes the cautious instinct is exactly what the situation requires, but it means you cannot tell the difference from the inside. The feeling of having thought carefully is not evidence that you thought carefully. It is a feeling the brain produces, reliably, consistently, regardless of the quality of the process that generated it. And there's another layer beneath this one. When the outcome of a decision turns out badly, the mind tends to revise its history. Not consciously, not deliberately. But the memory of what felt reasonable before the decision is gradually replaced by the memory of what the outcome revealed. The bad result feels, in retrospect, like it should have been foreseeable. The signals that weren't actually there before become, in the rear view, vivid and obvious. The person who made the decision, the careful, deliberate person, looks to themselves and others like someone who should have known. The judgment falls on the process as if the process were defective, when perhaps the process was reasonable and the outcome was simply the low-probability event that happened anyway. This revision makes learning almost impossible, because you're not learning from what actually went wrong. You're learning from a story your mind rewrote after the fact. You adjust your future behavior based on a reconstructed past that never quite happened the way you remember it. The careful person, trying to do better next time, is working from corrupted data. Go back to the man. 15 years, the decision point. What happened after didn't clarify the choice he faced. It obscured it. The outcome arrived, and everything that came before it reorganized itself around that arrival. If the outcome was bad, his caution looked like blindness. If it was good, his caution looked like wisdom. Neither reading had much to do with the actual quality of the thinking in the room on the day he made the call. But that is how the accounting gets done, after the fact, by results, not by process, and he knows this. He has always known this. Which means that at some level, he wasn't only deciding about the risk, he was deciding about how the decision would look afterward, what story it would allow him to tell, what version of himself it would leave intact. That pressure, invisible, legitimate, entirely human, was also in the room, also on the scale. Now add one more element, the people around him, the culture he operates in. Consider what happens when the environment a person works or lives in doesn't offer much room for the admission of doubt. When someone in that room says, "I'm not sure about this," and the air goes cold. When uncertainty is read as weakness, and weakness carries a cost. When the signal sent by the group, not maliciously, often not even consciously, is that hesitation damages standing. In those conditions, something remarkable happens. The person who genuinely isn't sure stops being able to think with their uncertainty. They push it down. They perform confidence, not because they feel it, but because the environment has made it costly not to. And the performance becomes the input. The act of suppressing doubt changes what gets said in the room, which changes what information the group operates on, which changes the decision itself. The caution is still there, but it's been driven underground. And underground, it doesn't improve the decision. It festers, unnamed, and shows up later as something else. If you find yourself thinking differently about decisions you've made in the past, about what you actually knew and what you only believed you knew, that kind of reflection is exactly what this channel is for. Follow along. The conversations here tend to go somewhere real. The collective pressure to appear certain doesn't only distort the individual, it distorts the group's ability to use what individuals actually know. The most valuable information in any high-stakes situation is often the information someone is least likely to share. The qualified judgment, the uncomfortable data point, the instinct that doesn't fit the prevailing story. If the environment penalizes the sharing of that information, it doesn't stop existing. It simply stops circulating, and the decision gets made on the subset of information that was safe enough to say out loud. This is not a dysfunction. This is the natural behavior of people in environments where the cost of admitting doubt is real and visible, and the benefit of staying quiet is immediate and concrete. Here is the version of this no one wants to sit with. Being careful, genuinely, consciously, deliberately careful, does not protect you from the mechanism. It may, in certain configurations, activate it more reliably, because the care itself is a signal to your own nervous system that this matters, that loss is possible, that you need to defend against it. and the defense goes up before the analysis begins. The belief that careful people make better decisions under risk is not wrong in all cases, but it contains an assumption that doesn't always hold, that the care operates cleanly, separately from the fear that triggers it. In practice, the two are entangled. The more something matters to you, the louder the signal of potential loss becomes. The louder that signal, the more the cognitive machinery orients itself around avoiding the bad outcome rather than evaluating all outcomes proportionally. You end up, in a very specific sense, thinking too hard about the wrong thing, not the full landscape of possibilities, the thing you're trying not to lose. And this is where the real discomfort lives. Not in the idea that careless people make mistakes. Everyone accepts that. The discomfort is in the possibility that the feeling of being careful, of having taken the decision seriously, of having done everything right, might itself be what got in the way. That the vigilance was real and sincere and still bent the calculation. That you can be both conscientious and wrong, and that the conscientiousness contributed to the wrongness. There's no clean fix for this. No step you take before a decision that fully removes the weight from the scale. There are approaches that help. Looking at a class of similar situations instead of treating each decision as singular, separating the quality of a process from the quality of its outcome, building environments where doubt can be spoken without cost. But none of these fully resolve the problem. They just reduce its reach. What tends to survive this understanding, if it's held honestly, without collapsing into either paralysis or false certainty, is something quieter than confidence. A kind of attentiveness that doesn't trust its own sense of carefulness completely. That knows the machinery is running, whether or not it can be seen. That holds the decision a little more loosely. Not because nothing matters, but because the grip itself changes what you can see. The careful person, reconsidered, is not someone who got it right. They are someone who is still inside it, in the middle of a process that was shaped, long before they sat down to think, by forces they will never fully account for. And knowing that, continuing anyway, is the only version of care that doesn't lie to itself.